Hi everyone, Dr. Kofi here again, and welcome to my YouTube channel, TutorMed, where everything medicine is simplified. We are still on the ECG interpretation, and in this video, we will examine the QRS complex. This will deal with only the introduction, as subsequent videos will treat pathologies like ventricular hypertrophies, bundle branch blocks, etc. And so, we will look at what the QRS complex is, the principles behind its naming, and then some pathologies they represent when they are abnormal. You know the TutorMed community vibe, right? You watch for the first 30 seconds, pause and take some time to like and share the video, and then subscribe to the channel if you have not done that yet. And then finally, leave your thoughts, your questions and comments in the comment section below after watching the video. Alright guys, let's get started. Very good. Let's spend a little time understanding the QRS complex. And so as usual, the first principles. The QRS complex represents ventricular depolarization, and there are two ventricles within the heart, the right ventricle and the left ventricle. But because the left ventricular myocardium is more robust than the right ventricle, the ECG pays attention to the depolarization of the left ventricle, and so the normal QRS complex represents the depolarization of the left ventricle alone. But in the event that a patient has right ventricular hypertrophy, we will see some changes in the QRS complex which speak for right ventricular hypertrophy. But the point here is that the normal QRS complex on the ECG represents the depolarization in the left ventricle. Now, atrial depolarization gives us a single wave called the P wave, but the depolarization of the left ventricle gives us a complex instead of a wave. Why is that the case? What is so unique about the ventricle that its depolarization gives us a complex instead of a wave? And so let's see the parts of the left ventricle. The left ventricle is made up of the apex, a part called the apex, which we will see later, the base, and then two walls, one of which is the septal wall, the wall that shares boundary with the right ventricle, and then the free wall, the part of the left ventricle which is not attached to anything. Now, we've mentioned apex and base. Think about the figures in mathematics which have apex and then a base. Can you think about any? Yes, you are right. The cone is one of them. The cone has an apex and a base. And another figure is the pyramid, also has got an apex and a base. And so the cone can be used to illustrate these parts of the ventricle. The shape of the left ventricle actually is like a cone. And so this is the apex. And directly opposite to the apex is the base. Now this is the septal wall. And this part shares a boundary with the right ventricle. And this right here is the free wall. Now the point here is that all these parts contribute to the depolarization of the left ventricle, producing waves. That is why the resultant ventricular depolarization is a complex instead of a single wave. Worth mentioning here is the fact that of all these parts, the septal wall is the first part to depolarize, followed by the apex and the base. And so on this slide, let's illustrate the parts of the heart. This is the heart showing its four chambers. Here is the right ventricle, and then the chamber of the left ventricle. Let's focus on the left ventricle here. Do you appreciate the conical shape of the ventricles, particularly the left ventricle? Alright, now this is the apex of the heart, or of the left ventricle. This part of the left ventricle has the most enormous myocardium, and this region contributes most to the ventricular contraction. This translates to mean that it is responsible for the most dominant wave in the complex. Now this diagram won't be a good one to show the base, but as said earlier, it is the region opposite the apex, and that would be here in this region, as indicated. Now here is the septal wall, and as indicated earlier, this is the first part of the ventricle to depolarize. Please remember that. The septal wall is the first to depolarize. Now, this is a free wall, which in a way is part of the base. Now, this is a diagram where the heart has not been sectioned longitudinally to show the chambers, but it shows the walls of the heart. And so, let's get the orientation here. This here is the left ventricle, and this is the right ventricle. How did I know the demarcation? Because of the vessels here. And here we have the left atrium. The right atrium is not shown here because it is a much anterior chamber. Do you see the conical shape of the left ventricle? This is the apex of the left ventricle, and opposite the apex is the base. Again, I want to stress on the fact that depolarization of the left ventricle is a complex because each of the parts of the left ventricle depolarizes. Alright, now let's see how the complex is named. What are the principles behind QRS nomenclature? Now note that per how the letters have been arranged, it means that the first wave is always a Q wave, and then the last wave is always the S wave. But this is not always the case. When describing the ventricular depolarization complex, which we know as QRS complex, we should take note of these principles. 1. That the first negative wave in the complex is what we call the Q wave. The emphasis is on the first negative wave. What this means is that if you have a QRS complex and then the first wave is positive, you cannot call that wave a Q wave. The Q wave has to be the first negative wave in the complex. The next rule is that the positive wave in the complex is what we call the R wave. So it doesn't matter whether the positive wave comes after a negative wave or not. Once it is a positive wave, that wave in the complex is called the R wave. The next principle again is that any negative wave which comes after the R wave is what we call the S wave. What this means is that for you to have an S wave, a negative wave should come after a positive wave, which is an R wave. And so these principles should be known inside out. Again, this means that not every first wave in the complex is a Q wave, and not every last wave in the complex is an S wave. Again, there are two other principles I wish to mention. That not all leads have the three waves in the QRS complex, and we will see why. The other principle is that whether or not a lead has a complex which has all the three waves, the ventricular depolarization is still regarded as a QRS complex. What this means is that there can be a complex with only Q and R waves, but conventionally, we will still call it a QRS complex, although technically it is a QR wave. Alright, now let's take a few seconds to understand the sequence of depolarization within the ventricles. As you know by now, in ventricular depolarization, the septum is the first to depolarize. And more importantly, the depolarization wave in the septum spreads from left to right. In other words, it moves in the left to right direction. Let's illustrate this. This is the heart, and that is the septum, which separates the right ventricle from the left ventricle. What you are saying is that the depolarization wave through the septum moves from the left to the right, as indicated by this arrow. What then does this mean? It means that left-sided leads will record this as a negative wave because the wave is moving away from it or from them, while right-sided leads will record the septal depolarization as a positive wave because the wave is moving towards it. Why? Because it moves from the left to the right direction, meaning the first wave in the complex for left-sided leads will be a septal Q wave. That means left-sided leads like lead 1, AVL, lead V4 to V6 will have Q waves, and it is normal to have Q waves in these leads. By now, you should be aware that to an extent, lead 2 might also have a Q wave because it is located on the left as well. But for right-sided leads like V1 to V3 and sometimes lead 3, there will be no Q waves. The last two waves in the complex, R and S, represent depolarization from the other parts of the ventricle, that is the apex and the base. Very good. So let's cool off here by practicing some of the principles we've discussed. Let's take some time to understand these various QRS complexes. The first one only has one wave, and that wave is an R wave. Why is it an R wave? Because it is the positive wave in that complex. Remember that we said although some QRS complexes in some leads will not have all the three waves, even if it is one, we still conventionally refer that wave as a QRS complex. Let's move on to the next one. The next one, we have two waves here, a positive wave and a negative wave. The positive wave is an R wave and the negative wave is an S wave. Why is it not a Q wave? It is because by definition the Q wave should be the first negative deflection, but this negative deflection came after the R wave, and so it is the S wave. Let's take a look at the third one. The third one, it has three waves. The first is a positive wave, and so we name it the R wave. The second is a negative wave, but this negative wave came after a positive wave, and so it is the S wave. Then after the S wave, we have another small positive wave. It is an R wave. Yes, by definition, every positive is an R wave. But to differentiate it from the previous positive, instead of calling it an R wave, we label it as an R prime. And so this QRS complex technically is an RS-R prime complex. Then the third one is one wave. Remember that this negative wave can be a Q wave because it is the first negative deflection. But it can also be an S wave because there is no positive deflection. So you can't tell whether it is a Q wave or an S wave, and so technically this is referred to as a QS complex, but conventionally again this is a QRS complex. Then let's look at the fifth one. The fifth one, we have the first negative deflection, and so that wave will be called a Q wave, and then after that it was followed by an R wave. So technically this is a QR complex, but conventionally it is a QRS complex. Then we have a first negative wave, an R wave, a Q wave, then a positive wave which is an R wave, and then a negative wave which is an S wave. So this is the correct QRS complex. Now for the QRS complex, all we are interested in is the QRS more positive or more negative? As in, is the dominant wave more positive or negative? That is what we are interested in. Now on this slide, let's look at how the QRS complexes look like in the precordial leads from V1 to V6. Notice that the waves here, which make up the QRS complex, are actually R and S wave. And in V1, you see that you have a dominant S wave compared to the R wave. And so, in V1, the QRS complex is predominantly negative. The same for V2, the S wave is more than the R wave, so predominantly negative. The same for V3. But when you come to V4, you realize that the QRS complex in V4 has a dominant R wave compared to the S wave. And the QRS complex in V5 has a dominant R wave, and then there is a little or no S wave. The QRS complex in V6 has a small negative wave, but this negative wave precedes a positive wave, and so that wave is a kill wave. And as mentioned, it is normal to have a kill wave in V6. The point I want to make here is that as you progressively move from V1 to V5 and V6, the R wave increasingly becomes prominent, and you realize that the R wave is small in V1 but a bit bigger in V2 compared to V1, and then in V3's R wave is more than V2's, and then V4's R wave is more than V3's, V5's R wave is more than V4. So you see that progression. That progression is known as the R wave progression, and this is how it is supposed to be. It is supposed to progressively increase from V1 to V5 and V6. If that doesn't happen, we say there is a loss of R wave progression, and that pathology represents something. Let me mention it here. It may speak for right ventricular hypertrophy, or it may speak for an anterior wall MI. So kindly take note of this R wave progression. Very good, guys, and well done for following the lecture till this point. On this slide, let's look at some of the pathologies the QRS may indicate. So the QRS may tell us about ventricular hypertrophies, left ventricular hypertrophy, right ventricular hypertrophy, and this actually is our next lecture. We'll treat this in our next video. Again, the QRS complex can tell us whether or not there are low voltages. If there are low voltages, it may indicate significant pericardial effusion. The QRS complex can tell us whether or not there are bundle branch blocks, whether there is a left bundle branch block or a right bundle branch block, whether the bundle branch block is a complete one or a partial or an incomplete bundle branch block. Again, by examining the QRS complex, if the source of the rhythm is ventricular, we may be able to tell just by examining the QRS complex. Another thing the QRS complex might tell us is anterior ventricular MI, and this is indicated by loss of the R wave progression, like I mentioned in the previous slide. If you have loss of R wave progression in the precordial leads, it may suggest anterior ventricular wall MI. And then last but not the least, the QRS complex can tell us about pathological Q waves. And pathological Q waves may indicate previous MI. And so, ladies and gentlemen of the TutorMed community, our take-home summary. The first point is that ventricular depolarization is a complex because the ventricular myocardium has different regions which depolarize: the septum, the apex, and then the base. And all these contribute to the waveform. That is why the ventricular depolarization is a complex, unlike atrial depolarization, which is just a single wave. Now, while granting the fact that ventricular depolarization has 3 waves at most, not all leads will have QRS complexes which have all 3 waves. Like indicated, some would have 2, some would have 1. And just like we saw in the precordial leads, you realize that in the precordial leads, the main waves there are R and S, and we still conventionally call that complex QRS complex. And for QRS complexes, what we want to know, especially in the precordial lead, is that is it predominantly positive or negative? In other words, is it a predominant R wave or an S wave? Or sometimes, is it predominantly a Q wave or an R wave? And so thanks for watching. Please leave your comments in the comment section below. Subscribe if you've not done that yet. And you can send your questions and then your thoughts to my email, blissmed@gmail.com. I'll be glad to respond to your questions. Bye, and see you in our next lecture, which features how to identify ventricular hypertrophies.